Excellencies, representatives of international IDEA member states, colleagues and friends present here in Canberra and attending online from around the world. My name is Adi Aman. I'm the Master of Ceremony today. Welcome to the launch of the State of Democracy in Asia and the Pacific report, which is a sister report of the Global State of Democracy report launched in Brussels just 2 days ago. We are indeed fortunate to be able to gather both in person as well as online. Before we begin, let us first see a welcome to the country video from the first owners of the land on which we are meeting today. As well as online. Before we begin, let us first see a welcome to the country video from the first owners of the land.
Yan, hello. Today we meet on the land of the Ngunnawal people, which Canberra sits. Canberra means meeting place, and it has been a place of gathering for my people for over thousands of years. Yan, hello. To me, a welcome to country is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, symbolising the traditional owners' consent to an event taking place on the land. On behalf of the Ngunnawal people, I would like to invite international IDEA to meet here on the sacred land. I stand here today in this place where once my ancestors before me camped and told stories of many years ago. I'm a proud Ngunnawal woman as I carry my ancestors in spirit with me as I walk into the future teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, the Aboriginal culture. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present today. I'd also like to acknowledge the other cultures that are in the room today. In keeping the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today. Yara, goodbye. Other cultures that are in the room today. In keeping the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me
You can tell from the way the auntie dresses that how cold Canberra is. We are very glad and honored to be able to launch the report here at the Museum of Australian Democracy, situated in this historic old Parliament House. We are very glad. I'd like to therefore invite its director, Ms. Daryl Karp AM, to deliver her welcoming remarks and to say a few words about the museum itself. Director, the floor and screen are yours. Its director, Ms. Daryl Karp AM, to deliver her welcoming remarks and to say a few words about the museum itself. Director, the floor and screen are yours.
Thank you, and hello and welcome to this magnificent members' dining room here at Old Parliament House. I'm Daryl Karp. I'm the Director of the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House, and I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and to welcome you, and particularly to welcome different cultures and First Nations people here today. This building has a special place in the history of our nation. It was built in 1927 as the first purpose-built Parliament House for our newly created national capital for our first federal parliament. Not necessarily the first federal parliament in existence, but for our federal parliament in their first Parliament House, I should say. And for 60 years it was the beating heart of the nation. It was designed, believe it or not, by the chief architect of the Department of Works. It was at the time that the building was being designed, money was particularly tight and the international competition was scrapped. And the Department of Works Chief Architect John Smith Murdoch took on this extraordinary job. And I say to people, whenever you are in the building, apologies to those who are online and not in the building, notice the details. The light fittings have all been handcrafted. You know, the handles were all made specifically for this particular building. It has been a National Heritage building. It reached the National Heritage Register recently, and it's now a museum that explores and celebrates the spirit of Australian democracy. I often say to our students who are visiting us, if democracy were a sport, Australia would be up there with the Olympic champions. We're one of only a handful of democracies around the world that has had seamless, peaceful transition between governments since federation. Our constitution was the first written by and voted on by the people. We have an independent electoral commission which sets electoral boundaries and manages elections. And we introduced the secret ballot and have one of the highest voter turnouts. It certainly helps that voting is compulsory. At the Museum of Australian Democracy, in a non-COVID year, we have approximately 500,000 visitors on site, and we provide learning programs for 90,000 students and teachers, as well as professional development for teachers of civics education, because we found there's a really big need in that space. Our digital offerings reach over 1 million people around the country, including our schools programs, which are live, tailored specifically for the classroom. But certainly the highlight for me over the past 4 years has been the research initiative Democracy 2025 with the University of Canberra's Institute of Governance and Policy Analysis under the leadership of Professor Mark Evans, whom we'll be hearing from a little bit later on. It was established in the context of the lowest recorded level of public trust and declining democratic satisfaction in Australia, an offset against debased semi-democracies around the world. So we decided that we needed to have some real data to present as evidence to how democracy actually was tracking in Australia. And we set out to audit the qualities of Australian democracy and to facilitate non-partisan conversations aimed at improving democratic practice. We've published a number of reports. They're all available online, but one of the most interesting ones, I think, has been the development of baseline research into how young people, students, see their democracy. Because if you can't connect young people with their democracy, then the future's not going to be particularly bright. And we're finalising right now a comprehensive democratic audit with all of the states, universities in all of the states and territories, in conjunction with the London School of Economics and Political Science, and that will be released early next year. Museums are uniquely trusted places for, and they're highly rated for credible content and impartial voices. And we take that responsibility very, very seriously. We are uniquely placed to inform, inspire and empower. So I'm particularly delighted and honoured to welcome you all here today to this site or online and to share our wonderful Museum of Australian Democracy here at Old Parliament House. Enjoy the sessions today. Thank you. Honoured to welcome you all here today to this site or online and to share our wonderful Museum of Australian Democracy here at Old Parliament House. Enjoy the sessions today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Daryl Karp, for welcoming us all. It is now my great pleasure to invite the Secretary General of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, His Excellency Dr. Kevin Casas-Zamora, to convey his opening remarks. He is unfortunately unable to be with us here in person. Therefore, he is joining us online from Stockholm, Sweden, where International IDEA has its headquarters. He is unfortunately unable. Your Excellency, the screen is yours. Here in person. Therefore, he is joining us online from Stockholm, Sweden, where International IDEA has its headquarters. He is unfortunately unable. Your Excellency, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome also from my side to the Asia-Pacific launch of International IDEA's Global State of Democracy Report 2021. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm very happy to be able to greet you all today from Europe. Although I would much have rather preferred to be with you in Canberra, circumstances would have allowed. Nevertheless, I would very much like to thank Director Daryl Karp for enabling us to hold this virtual launch from the Museum of Australian Democracy and for her welcoming remarks. Dr. Karp, I must also say that your tagline, "You can't lock down democracy," is a fantastic one. I would also like to thank the Australian ambassador to Sweden, Ambassador Philip, good friend, for his presence here today. Australia has been the chair of our Council of Member States this year, and we have been grateful for the excellent support and collaboration throughout.
And finally, I would also like to thank Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister, for sending us a video in Greek. I have huge admiration for Taiwan's unceasing efforts to maintain and improve democracy, and also for the way it handled the pandemic while safeguarding and even advancing democracy. Now, almost 2 years ago, I stood, not so far from here, at the global launch of our previous iteration of the report. Little did we know then how much the world and democracy in the world would change only a few months later. 2 years ago, our analysis was pointing out that while the number of democracies was increasing, the quality of democracy was decreasing. The message, nonetheless, still had a hint of optimism. The number of countries holding credible and competitive elections had continued to grow, and previously undemocratic regimes like Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Sudan, to name a few cases, were undergoing inspiring democratization processes. Then the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, threatening lives, livelihoods, but also democracies. And as with humans, the virus hit those with pre-existing conditions the hardest. The pandemic accelerated and magnified ongoing political trends while adding a whole new plethora of unprecedented challenges to democratic institutions and processes. Virtually overnight, all democratic systems found themselves dealing with enormous obstacles. Holding safe and credible elections in the midst of the pandemic became a monumental effort, as was ensuring the functioning of legislative and judicial institutions during lockdowns and limiting circumstances. Not so much, it has to be said, in Asia Pacific. While the rest of the world was still grappling with how to hold elections during a pandemic, several countries in your region held both successful and safe elections. South Korea was one of these first success stories that showed the world that it was possible. But then we also had Mongolia, New Zealand, Taiwan, and Australia that managed remarkably well. Some of them, particularly Taiwan, not simply managed to hold the elections and reach a surprisingly high turnout, but also introduced digital innovations and countering misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. The new challenges, however, were not confined to the functioning of elections, parliaments, and judiciaries. If anything, the most prominent challenge for democracy was that governments all over the world felt compelled and also tempted to deploy wide-ranging emergency powers to confront the calamity that had befallen the world. As I'm sure you've guessed by now, the diagnosis is pretty dire. The 2 years since our last report have not been good for democracy. The monumental human victory achieved when democracy became the predominant form of governance now hangs in the balance like never before. It is not simply that the number of democracies has decreased, but that some of the worst reversals have happened precisely in places like Myanmar, a country that 2 years ago was being hailed in our report for its democratic progress. We had the fortune to have Aung San Suu Kyi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the National Unity Government of Myanmar, NUG, and an elected member of parliament following the Myanmar elections in November 2020, write the foreword for this report. She was never able to be sworn in due to the military coup in February of this year. As she states, since the coup took place, political leaders, journalists, judges, minorities, and activists have been increasingly harassed and persecuted. Elections are being delayed indefinitely, and though everything seems quite dire, she remains optimistic about democracy's resilience. And so do we. International IDEA will continue to, in a vigorous way, support the democratic forces of Myanmar. So yes, democracies have disappeared in a few cases, But perhaps more worryingly, their quality continues to decline in many more cases, including established large countries where this would have been unimaginable only a few years ago. Democratic backsliding, namely the sustained and deliberate process of subversion of basic democratic tenets by political actors and governments, is threatening to become a different kind of pandemic. It now afflicts very large and very influential democracies that account for over a quarter of the world's population. In the context of the pandemic, many democratic governments have adopted questionable restrictions to fundamental freedoms that in many cases mimic the practices of authoritarian regimes. And all this is happening while authoritarian regimes in turn intensify their repressive tactics and engage in ever more brazen attempts to silence their critics and distort the workings of democracies. Just think for a second about how Belarus rerouted a plane full of passengers so that it could arrest a democracy activist. We have never seen that before. It is clear that the effects of this global crisis will take many years, if not decades, to become clear. Yet, over the past 2 years, we have researched and gathered enough data to evaluate some of the initial consequences, but also to identify many of the dangers and opportunities for democracy that comes with them. This is the research that we are presenting here today. A health check of democracy in the age of COVID-19. An examination that aspires to be comprehensive, rigorous, nuanced, and constructive. Our comprehensive conceptual framework unpacks and dissects the many facets of the democratic construct, including the workings of representative institutions, the protection of fundamental rights, the robustness of checks and balances, and the vibrancy of popular participation. We have also tried, very consciously, to be nuanced in our analysis and go beyond the incessant negativity of the most recent headlines about democracy. Always predicting a bear market for democracy is easy. It is also inaccurate and unhelpful. We want to give visibility to the positive events that we have seen in the last few years, because there are promising trends that also need to be displayed to keep hope alive. And we want to be constructive, because democracy needs help. It needs solutions and proposals, and that's why our report makes a point of putting forward policy recommendations to not only guide, but inspire those working in the trenches of democracy. With this report, we want to convey a sense of urgency about the global plight of democracy, but also of opportunity. We want to press upon our audiences the message that this is the best time for democratic actors to be bold. This is the time to revitalize democracy so that it can cope with even sterner challenges that lie ahead, including those posed by the climate crisis. This calls for a global endeavor. And that's why efforts such as the EU Democracy Action Plan, the upcoming Summit for Democracy, but also the actions by countries, including our member states, matter more than ever. We need to let democratic reformers know that they are not alone. In the process of doing that, we should never forget why this work matters. This is about more than safeguarding abstract principles or winning geopolitical battles. It is about protecting the dignity of real human beings, which democracy does better than any other political arrangement. Every democratic reversal is not a geopolitical battle lost. It is a constellation of lives that goes dark. We are witnessing in Afghanistan today a group of human beings that have lost their opportunity to fulfill their potential and dreams. And that is also our loss. This report is a small contribution to this struggle. It is very small compared to the deeds that are performed on a daily basis by the brave young pro-democracy activists in Myanmar, by the women that refuse to be cowed by fanatics in Afghanistan, by the citizens that have not withdrawn their umbrellas in Hong Kong, by the jail opposition leaders in Nicaragua, by the dissidents that are daring to say out loud what the rest of society whispers in Cuba, that no amount of repression can hide that their absolute rulers are naked and lost. Each of these acts of defiance is a triumph of the human spirit that deserves that we pay homage and recommit ourselves to the democratic project. This report is our small tribute and our sincere pledge that we will use the knowledge we gather and the experience we accrue to help reformers improve democracy where it exists, to support those who fight for democracy where it doesn't exist, and to inspire the million others that need to join this cause if democracy is to endure and prevail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your opening remarks. We do have a special message from a special guest, Honorable Audrey Tang, the Digital Minister of Taiwan, who has been instrumental in championing the idea of digital social innovation to empower democracy. The Minister is also unable to be with us in person, but has kindly provided a pre-recorded message.
Good local time, everyone. I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Digital Minister. It is my great pleasure and honor to be here virtually at the launch of the State of Democracy in Asia and the Pacific report of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Ever since the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the whole planet, in many parts of the world, we've seen symptoms of democracy in backslide. Some authoritarian regimes have tried to impose restrictions and public surveillance in the name of public health. But in Taiwan, digital social innovations continue to accelerate democracy and deepen collaboration across sectors. I believe there are three pillars that are essential for Taiwan to counter the pandemic with no lockdown, and these are fast, fair, and fun. Fast is for fast response. When the Chinese whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang first reported a SARS-like illness in Wuhan on December 30th, 2019, it was immediately shared on Taiwan's pro-social social media, the PTT. And as soon as January 1st, 2020, the government launched the counter-coronavirus containment campaign and started health inspections for all flight passengers coming in from Wuhan. Fair is for fair access for all. That's why we introduced the face mask maps, initiated by social entrepreneurs working with the decentralized community of G0V or GovZero, a group of civic hackers in Taiwan, so that people everywhere in Taiwan can look at the details of where the medical-grade masks are in stock. And finally, fun, which means humor over rumor, turning outrage into creativity so we can overcome disinformation and difficulties together. And based on these three pillars, we've succeeded in containing the virus during the early stages of the global pandemic in 2020. But this year, when we're faced with the real first wave of COVID case surge in May, we needed to speed up contact tracing processes. Again, we did not resort to authoritarian measures. For example, the early measures to record the contact information of people entering or leaving public venues led to the quick development of the 1922 SMS-based contact tracing system in just 3 days. And it's not a government technology, not a government innovation. This intuitive, app-free design from G0V GovZero is, of course, from decentralized civic technologists, It's an easy way to check in at public places, but without any compromise on anyone's privacy. It's based on well-understood principle of SMS, and moreover, anyone can look up who has accessed these records from the contact tracing offices in the past 4 weeks. Also, if you don't feel comfortable using the SMS system on your mobile phone carrier, well, you can still use your pen and paper. And this is because we know in a pluralistic democracy, it is never an easy task to strike a balance between resilience and universally shared values such as human rights. Of course, we need to preserve freedom of speech and rule of law. So in Taiwan, as in many democracies around the world, we're doing our best, taking care of all the different positions and through social innovation. To conclude, I would like to again extend my sincerest appreciation for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. I am very happy to be able to travel digitally across time zones and boundaries and witness Taiwan's efforts to protect and promote democracy recognized by such a prestigious organization. So we know we are not alone. I believe Taiwan's experience, the Taiwan model, can help unite forces of good for all democracies, and together we can co-create a shared reality for collective intelligence, for social innovation to thrive. And let's march together to an open, free, democratic, and resilient world. Thank you for listening. Live long and prosper.
Thank you very much, Minister Tang, for that special message, indeed. It is now time for us to learn about the main findings of the state of democracy in the Asia and the Pacific report. Old resilience, new challenges. The report was co-authored by Ms. Lena Rikila-Tamang, International Ideas Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, and Mr. Mark Salter, himself a former staff member of International IDEA. As with any credible reports, the report was peer-reviewed. I would like to hereby take the opportunity to thank the peer reviewers, Dr. Imelda Dainla, who has kindly agreed to take part in the panel discussion later on, who is here with us today, Dr. Tom Gerald Daly, Dr. Peter D'Souza, Dr. S.Y. Quraishi, an esteemed member of the International IDEA Board of Advisors, and former Chief Election Commissioner of India. To present the main features of the report, I would like to now invite Ms. Lena Rikila-Tamang, the lead author of the report, to take the floor. Ma'am.
Thanks, Eddie, and welcome everyone. Wonderful to see you all here on site and online. I will present some selected top-line findings from the report, hoping to entice you to read the full report and look at the country-specific analysis later. The Global State of Democracy report that was launched on Monday includes as one of its main messages that authoritarianism is on the rise, but resilience and democratic pushback are alive as well. Much of that resonates in the Asia and the Pacific region, but with some important caveats and nuances. Our definition of democracy is simple: popular control over public decision-making and equality between citizens in exercise of that control, recognizing that democracy comes in many forms and shapes, depending on a particular society's history, culture, and set of priorities. And I think that's something important to underline here as well. In our analysis, we measure to what extent a country has realized aspects of democratic ideals along 5 main attributes: representative government, fundamental rights, checks on government, impartial administration, and participatory engagement. Each of these attributes has then number of sub-attributes and individual indicators. So this is the framework we use to study in our investigation of state of democracy. And the report is based on two main databases: International IDEA's Global State of Democracy Indices and a global monitoring tool of pandemic's impact on democracy and human rights. But to start with just one slide on the global picture, which is that world is becoming more authoritarian. Since 2016, Since 2016, the number of countries moving in the direction of authoritarianism is 3 times the number moving towards democracy. Outside of 2020, the other notable peak toward authoritarianism was in 2009 in the wake of global financial crisis. So what about Asia and the Pacific? Perhaps needless, yet important to say that the region is defined by its immense diversity, also in terms of regime type, including some of the most enduring authoritarian countries and some of the best performing democracies in the world. The region has its distinct sub-regions, from nearly authoritarian Central Asia to democratic Oceania. Yet, the regional tendency in Asia too is towards deepening authoritarianism, autocratization, and erosion of democracy. In this report, we covered 32 countries, so not entire region is included, leaving many of the Pacific Island countries out due to lack of data, but that's something we actually currently working on to rectify in the coming reports. In terms of democratic development, yesterday was not better in Asia and the Pacific. For the last 20 years, democracies have outnumbered authoritarian and hybrid regimes. And in fact, in recent years, most countries have maintained their regime types. Most dramatic reversals, as we know, have taken place now in Myanmar, Afghanistan, and also the stifling legal changes in Hong Kong in 2021. To note the category of hybrid regimes, where countries have elements of competitive elections but do not fulfill criteria of democracy, it's a persistent one. And it has not really served as a stepping stone to democracy in the region, with some positive exceptions: Malaysia in 2018, Sri Lanka 2015 after brief period of hybridity. With equally worrying than numbers, as was mentioned, is the decline in the quality of governance in existing democracies. But again, both progress and retreats from democracy are found across Asia and the Pacific. A continuation of severe decline in democracy was recorded in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and the Philippines. And these two, India and the Philippines, the decline is amounting to what we call democratic backsliding. Perhaps worth noting that the United States is also listed as backsliding democracy in 2020. And it may be worth mentioning that amongst the world's top 10 decliners 2020, none are from Asia-Pacific region, but from other regions, including from Europe. On the other side, several advances are also there. Progress toward democracy has taken place in Papua New Guinea, Taiwan, Republic of Korea, Malaysia, to mention few. An advance has taken place also in some authoritarian countries, indicating that even these seemingly intractable authoritarian regimes are not static, and emphasizing the importance of supporting the emerging voices for democracy in these contexts. Attacks on institutions central to integrity of democracies, including parliaments, judiciary, and media, represented a significant challenge already well prior to the pandemic. Over the last 5 years, the biggest decliners in checks on government are the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, followed by Nepal, Vietnam, Kyrgyzstan, and India, and the positive outliers, Uzbekistan, Thailand, but also Republic of Korea, as well as Malaysia, and was Myanmar. Over the last 5 years, scores on fundamental rights have remained relatively stable in Asia and the Pacific region. The most significant declines taken place in Indonesia, followed by Cambodia, India, and the Philippines. Has to be said that during the pandemic, no country escaped the difficult balancing of individual versus collective rights, and all countries of the region imposed some restrictions of the movement. But it is under the fundamental rights that some of the biggest future worries lie. The report itself is discussing rising ethno-nationalism, intensified xenophobia, exacerbated by the stress of the pandemic, undermining pluralism, increasing polarization. For example, in Indonesia, freedom of religion is its all-time low since 1975, and same tendency is in many other countries. And secondly, the growing reliance on emergency legislation to deal with pandemic gave a certain normalcy to harsh policy measures. And reversing this normalcy and militarization or securitization of politics will require democratic pushback. And thirdly, in a number of countries in the region, democratization has not served as an antidote to corruption. Even when other aspects of democracy may have improved, corruption has prevailed or even worsened over the last 45 years, hence eroding trust on institutions. In terms of number of women in parliament, the bottom 4 are democracies in the region, and so are the top 2, but none yet reaching the parity, though New Zealand is coming close with 49%. And no doubt, also the resourceful authoritarian countries pose a challenge to democracies. China has continued to grow its influence in the region and beyond, while at the same time its own scores on civil liberties and checks on government have further declined. To sum up the pandemic's impact on democracy in Asia and the Pacific, it has deepened democratic divide, magnifying the pre-existing strengths and weaknesses, but also added some new layers of challenges. Authoritarian countries tended to tighten their grip, whereas some countries were able to rely on their, at times, perhaps latent strengths, and in some countries, the democratic reforms were put on halt due to pandemic. And as was mentioned, just as with individuals, the pandemic was most dangerous for those with some pre-existing conditions. The pandemic brought unjustifiable restrictions on freedom of expression in both authoritarian countries as well as in democracies. But still, there is outstanding resilience. And as was mentioned, particularly Taiwan was leading the innovations on how to use technology in countering disinformation and fake news. I think this is extremely important to note in view of future unknown disruptions to our democracies. And of course, the popular demands for democratic freedom, political reform were not muted, with protests seen in Hong Kong, India, Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, and among other places, and in solidarity, even in the face of severe risks and brutal use of force to repress them. Elections were organized around the region, providing vital lessons for future. South Korea showing the way in March 2020. And while in 2020, the regional outlook for the quality of elections in Asia and the Pacific was positive. Some small declines here and there, even if ever so slight, sent also a warning sign, particularly as the region faces a year of many major elections in 2022 and 24 in particular. to end, I just wanted to very quickly show you a glimpse on how to access the country profiles, as given that we also have country experts in our panel. That was the landing page. Here is Afghanistan in 2000, fully authoritarian, all aspects on red. Come 2006, country is a hybrid regime with some advancements on number of aspects. And again, regressing to authoritarian regime in 2016, to return to a hybrid regime in 2020, with some real advancements on media integrity in particular. There's much to talk about, of course, on Afghanistan. This is simply to show that progress is often painstaking and easy to lose. In contrast, perhaps Australia, high-performing democracy, in 2015 almost entirely green, except the direct democracy in red. But in 2020, we have in education and independent media. Maybe say to future-proof, but not to ironclad the institution so as to stay nimble and responsive in view of future crises. And from the website, you can find many more concrete policy recommendations, the global report, 4 regional reports, the case studies and the indices and infographics and much more. Thank you very much for your attention.
Please bear with us for a couple of minutes while we set up the stage for the panel discussion. May I ask the moderator and the panelists to take their seats? So we have now arrived at the interactive session, the panel discussion on the state of democracy in Asia and the Pacific. The discussion will be moderated by Professor Mark Evans, speaking on the left-hand side of the screen. At the end. Professor Mark Evans is from the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra. Professor Evans has played an international role in supporting change governance practices and has acted as a senior policy advisor, designer of leadership programs, and chief investigator for research and evaluation projects in 26 countries, the United Nations, European Union, and the World Bank. And then joining him as panelists next to him is Dr. Imelda Denla, whom I've mentioned earlier. She's from the Ateneo School of Government in the Philippines. As mentioned, she was one of the peer reviewers of the report. Dr. Denla is a developmental lawyer and is currently working on an EU-funded justice and human rights program to operationalize and strengthen the multi-level justice system provided in the Bangsamoro Organic Law. She has published extensively on judicial politics, legal pluralism, hybrid justice and peace building, as well as on civil society and military relations in Mindanao, Philippines. Next to Dr. Dainla is Professor Edward Aspinall of Coral Bell School of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. Professor Aspinall researches politics in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, with interests in democratization, ethnicity, and clientelism, among other topics. His latest book, co-authored with Dr. Ward Berendschot, is entitled Democracy for Sale, Elections, Clientelism, and the State in Indonesia. Our last, but certainly not least, panelist, person on the extreme right of the screen, is Dr. Nematullah Bizan of the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Dr. Bizan used to be a government official in his native Afghanistan. His book, 8 Paradoxes in Afghanistan, Building and Undermining the State, examines the process of state building and international intervention in Afghanistan. He is currently working on an edited volume on state fragility, drawing lessons across 7 countries in diverse regions. I now hand over the floor and the screen to Professor Evans, who will lead the panel discussion. Professor.
Many thanks, Audrey, and many thanks to International IDEA for inviting me to facilitate this fantastic panel this afternoon. The purpose of this panel discussion is to drill down in more detail in relation to the patterns that Lena has just described in this fantastic report. And as I said, we've got a wonderful range of experts to help us with this task. So I want to begin by asking you all, and I'll ask Edward to start in response. How do the findings of the report echo with your analysis? And are there any specific issues that you think are missing?
Thanks, and first of all, congratulations to the authors of the report. I do think it's a terrific and really comprehensive report. As an Indonesia specialist, so one of the countries that we've just seen has experienced one of the more dramatic declines in democracy in recent years, certainly many of the main thrusts of the report really did resonate with what I and colleagues have been observing in Indonesia, but also in several other of the countries of Southeast Asia. But I would also add that one of the sort of refreshing and perhaps even to some extent unexpected elements of reading the report was to see that it's not purely, as we've already heard, in fact, that it's not purely a sort of a story of doom and gloom, that there are countries which have been performing well, countries that certainly from my perspective as a Southeast Asia expert we don't often think about. I noticed that Uzbekistan, for example, is there as having experienced quite a lot of democratic progress. So that's one thing, that there is that despite the talk we have of the global democratic recession, there are positive performers as well as ones experiencing decline there. Another thing that really struck me looking through some of the particular charts in the report is this sort of long-term transition towards transition away from authoritarianism towards sort of, I don't know quite how to put it, but democratic mediocrity or the sort of middle range performance in a lot of places. So if you look at some of the charts in the report that sort of trace progress from 1975 to 2020, there's one on electoral integrity, for example, you see that there's been a dramatic decline in the number of countries which have poor quality elections, but not much of an increase in those which have really good quality elections. It's that middle range which has really increased. And there were quite a few of the other charts, I think, which struck me as showing that very similar, really long-term trend. One on civil society, if I'm not misremembering, but also the one on media integrity. So they were sort of a couple of the big picture findings which really struck me. Just sort of reflecting on some of the work on some of the material on COVID as well. I think it's important to note that as well as sort of the opportunism which has been demonstrated by sort of aggrandizing governments throughout the region, the picture in terms of social attitudes and how publics are responding towards these autocratizing measures is quite mixed. We've done some research at the Coral Bell School through a project called the Southeast Asia Rules-Based Order Project, where we did some surveys on public attitudes in Southeast Asia, and we found this really mixed picture actually towards how the public in several Southeast Asian countries were feeling about what the pandemic meant in terms of the need for a more autocratic or a form of government that was more respectful of individual rights, and quite a mixed picture actually across the region, which I'd be happy to explore later for those who want to know more about that particular research. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Imelda.
Thank you, Mark. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate International IDEA, and really very honored to be somehow part of the review process. I really enjoyed it, and definitely it's something that really resonates in the work that I do. As I was looking at Lina's presentation, it still really surprises me, strikes me, especially coming from a country that has really gained so much in the last decades in terms of its democratization processes. In fact, the Philippines is to be considered one of the brightest, probably in Asia and the Pacific. So its score is even probably, when I was doing the first one, was actually a little above the median range, and only to see it really exhibiting that significant backsliding. And so it really strikes me to really reflect that, well, of course, it's sort of a cliche to say that it's actually easy to destroy democracy and its democratic institutions than to build and rebuild democracy. And so really the task is really upon us. And for me, like as a Filipino, no, and coming from that perspective, it's really hard to see the kind of the opposite of progress that is happening now. But you know, to conform to my script, I would like to also point out to certain of factors that probably should be looked more in detail. And one of that is really the rampancy, the proliferation of fake news. That is really engulfing the whole of Asia and the Pacific, and that is already been shown by other countries, India, but of course what has Taiwan has experienced, especially during the elections. And we know that the Philippines is actually the center of fake news. It is actually ground zero, and is in fact considered an infodemic. In our school, we just recently concluded a survey of over 30,000 youth respondents, and we see an majority of them are actually very deficient in identifying fake news and real news. In fact, they could no longer distinguish between what is real and what is fake. So fake news, disinformation, misinformation basically undermines the very fabric of our democracy. And we can see that it undermines all aspects of democracy, from fundamental rights, media, to checks on government. So I think greater efforts really should be put into combating fake news. The second one that has not been really highlighted is the electoral related violence. And that is something that many countries in Asia Pacific are really grappling. And of course, we know it doesn't only undermine the electoral outcomes, but also the very fabric of society. Again, we are also conducting a research on electoral violence in the Philippines, and we can see a very alarming trend in terms of increasing electoral violence in the past couple of years. And lastly, I would also like to call on one aspect that is also overlooked, and that is judicial independence, an area that I'm very passionate about. We see that most of those who are the decliners and those who have weak and mid-range democracies really have very weak judicial institutions. Many of them lack judicial independence. And for me, in my study, I've seen that it's not just about the politics that is impinging on, on the capacity and the capability of the courts to give independent decisions, but factors like judicial structural, institutional design, judicial leadership, but also institutional culture are all important and interrelated, and that we should be paying more attention to. And of course, last but not the least, I think in terms of gender, and that has been articulated in the report quite extensively, but insofar as judicial independence is concerned, we have very little judges actually across the Asia Pacific. There are very few women actually in the top positions of our judiciary, and my work shows that actually having more women maybe could actually improve judicial independence in some countries.
Thank you, Melda. I mean, we'll look at some of the issues relating to the impending elections in the Philippines and Indonesia later on. Nemat, when we first met after the fall of the Taliban back in 2002-3, we were very, very excited at the prospects of democratization in Afghanistan. Findings in the report surprise you, but what do we really need to focus on in terms of understanding the future of democracy in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Professor, and also I can join colleagues to congratulate the author of the report and colleagues. The case of Afghanistan shows an extreme situation as we observed it after the collapse of the first government of the Taliban in 2001. And we didn't expect that the situation would evolve as it happened in August this year, but it was also not unexpected because the tragedies were in the making for a long time. The finding of this report confirms some of the issues. And in particular, I would like to highlight three broad factors maybe can help us in the future to reassess the state of democracy. In addition to looking a country from within, also external factors are quite important. Coming to the case of Afghanistan, geopolitics and regime type in the region did matter a lot. Afghanistan is surrounded by authoritarian and hybrid regimes, so making the chance of survival of a democratic regime much more difficult. And second one, what we had in Afghanistan was power rivalry between different regional countries, India and Pakistan, Russia, US, China. They influenced the developments in Afghanistan. Pakistan supported, sponsored the Taliban. So that really challenged the political order, a democratic regime in Afghanistan. Second one I would like to highlight is that's the role of international community. While that's quite difficult to unpack, I would rather call it the US and its allies. The role in Afghanistan has been quite paradoxical. If we look at two phases, they provided massive economic and military aid to Afghanistan for state building and also to finance the war on terror. So what we saw in Afghanistan, that military objectives subordinated the state building agenda and also democratization. In the first phase, the international community bypassed the state and delivered their aid directly to beneficiaries and also allocated a large portion of it to military objectives. What was the result of that? Prolonging state weakness and fragmentation. And then what happened? Again, same error. During the peace-building process, the agreement which the US signed with the Taliban excluded a legitimate government from the process. So that was a green light to the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, I mean military takeover. And then coming to internal politics, politics of patronage, a late fragmentation in Afghanistan, corruption, and also electoral fraud. And the previous two presidential elections, they were major issues, but the internal weaknesses were not as such to lead to the collapse or reversal of democracy and to an authoritarian regime, or now what we see is a totalitarian regime in Afghanistan. But it was rather more external forces. Just want to briefly mention the missed opportunities. One was we missed to include the Taliban in a settlement process as early as in 2001. Same mistake is being repeated. The Taliban is not willing, the group is not willing to engage into a political settlement. Second, we missed to reach a regional settlement about Afghanistan among neighboring countries and hold those countries influencing Afghanistan to account, such as Pakistan. Third, the US could have a more pragmatic strategy, appreciating the realities in Afghanistan rather than driving the policies based on politics in Washington. And the last one, also we missed the opportunity to reach a political contract between the state and society in Afghanistan. One last point I would like to mention is time factor. Once a democracy is challenged, especially through armed conflict, as early stages, the chance of survival is quite low. And that's what we saw in Afghanistan. Thank you.
And then, of course, if 90% of the international disbursement is spent on security issues rather than jobs, you know, the potential for democratic retreat is always going to be there.
Absolutely.
Look, I'm just going to comment briefly on the Australian case and on how we can judge the performance of Australian democracy. Australia is characterized in the report as a high-performing democracy relative to other Asia and Pacific democracies on 14 out of 16 democratic indices. And particular reference, as Lena said, is made to the quality of representative government, the protection of fundamental rights, effective checks on government, impartial administration, electoral participation, and local democracy. Australia is reported to perform less well on certain areas of participatory engagement, such as civil society participation, equality of gender representation in Parliament, and poorly in terms of the use of direct democratic arrangements, which have rarely been part of Australia's democratic culture. Now, we should, of course, have very high expectations for Australia's democratic performance, given that it is the most mature democracy in the region. Indeed, in my view, Australia has a moral obligation to be the model of democracy in the region. In January, we'll be reporting on the findings of the Democratic Audit of Australia, the first comprehensive audit of the qualities of Australian democracy. And there are 6 areas of democratic risk that we are already identifying. First, although the evidence clearly demonstrates that Australia's elections are free and expertly administered by the Independent Australian Election Commission, the Electoral Integrity Project has observed that uncontrolled government advertising in the run-up to the 2019 election, problems with our political funding and disclosure scheme, and growing concern about political donations made by vested interests increasingly undermine Australia's claim to fair elections, because these factors mean that incumbent governments are placed at a very significant advantage at election time. Second, Australia is now amongst the most centralised federal states in the world, in spite of encompassing a whole continent. And financial dependence on the Commonwealth is amongst the highest of all federations, third only to Belgium and Austria, and it accounts for 44% of all states' revenue. Federal government spending accounts for almost 22% of annual GDP, and this, of course, has increased as a consequence of the fiscal stimulus during COVID. So we're experiencing massive vertical fiscal imbalances in the Federation. And we're seeing the incremental accretion of economic power to the Commonwealth government by engaging in policy domains not conferred on it by the Constitution and using funding agreements to control policy systems and indicative programs. OECD data has shown that from 1995 to 2019, the state and local share of expenditure by all three levels of Australian government increased by 4.7%, but their share of national tax revenues fell by 3.1%. We can also see the way in which executive dominance is being displayed in other ways. Westminster principles of parliamentary democracy have come under challenge with mounted integrity challenges, the increasing politicisation of the Australian public service, and gridlock between the current government and the Australian public service on the way forward. And that was reflected in the abortive 2019 APS review. In short, the executive is wielding disproportionate power in Australia's democratic settlement, which undermines the effectiveness of traditional checks and balances through the separation of powers. Thirdly, to be frank, it is at best problematic to assume that the fundamental rights of all Australian citizens are effectively protected through the rule of law. Australia was recently subject to a damning critique of its human rights record by the United Nations Human Rights Committee with regard to the rights of Indigenous children, particularly the incarceration of Indigenous children throughout Australia, the treatment of refugees, domestic violence, transgender rights, the sterilisation of intellectually disabled women and girls, and the impact of anti-terrorism laws on civil liberties. And fourth, Australia, I'm afraid, is far from free from corruption, maladministration, and poor, often illegal parliamentary behaviour. And we've seen over this year evidence from both sides of politics of various forms of rorting and misconduct at the Commonwealth and state levels, demonstrating that a lack of integrity in public office has become culturally embedded in democratic governance. And finally, the composition of the Commonwealth Parliament is not representative of the community it serves, either in gender or ethnic terms on any population measures. And this is much broader than the visible case of Indigenous underrepresentation, but includes other groups as well. Contrast, for example, the representation of British Australians, represented by 10 members for 3.8% of the population. Contrast that with Chinese Australians, 2.5% of the population. Indian Australians, 3% of the population, represented by one senator. So in sum, the Australian Parliament, I'm afraid, is packed full of people that look like me. And I'm certainly not representative of 70% of the Australian population. So in summary, Australian democracy is in flux. And as we've seen already, democracy is a living, fragile thing to be nurtured and protected everywhere, not just in the developing areas. Now, what is certain here is that the next federal election will be won or lost on which party is best able to forge a national consensus on a post-COVID-19 recovery plan. And that's not a mere matter of economics, but it's about what type of society we want to live in, the values that should drive it, and crucially, the form of democracy which will best protect us in a turbulent and uncertain world. But anyway, enough of Australian democracy. A question for Imelda. In many South and Southeast Asian countries, the military has never quite left the political scene, has it? And during the pandemic, governments almost inevitably have relied heavily on the military in their COVID response. Even here in Australia, the military has been brought back in to help with the vaccine rollout. Do you see this tendency as dangerous for democracy? And what do you think the consequences are of prolonged state of emergencies like the one in the Philippines?
That's a very difficult question, but first of all, of course, we can acknowledge the important role that the military, the security sector plays during the time of pandemic in ensuring that health protocols and safety are implemented. But on one hand, we know that many of countries in Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia, of course Thailand, the Philippines, have had various episodes of military dictatorships, strong military influence in the political affairs. And of course, we know that democratization has not really, and despite security sector reform, there are, the reforms were quite slow and really, in many countries, did not really take root. Of course, their continuing role in the age of pandemic is really something to worry about, especially in the case of the Philippines, where increasing military role, we can see the trend, no, in terms of the increasing influence and power of the military in civilian authority, and that is not limited to the appointments of ex-generals, for example, in civilian ministries, but also the role of the military as the primary implementer of the COVID response is really something that we are seeing, for example, again, in the Philippines and in Indonesia. And this is really very concerning because when you delegate that sort of so much power in the military and the security sector, and knowing that they are actually very weak and have very weak foundations, we can expect that would be susceptible to abuse of authority. And of course, we can see the diminishing rule of law in many of the countries. Of course, in the Philippines, we can see that once the military, and we can see that the influence now with the military is quite high, particularly in the Philippines, and we see a lot of human rights abuses that is happening now, and of course, and that's the result of giving an accounted power, but also in strengthening, in consolidating so much executive power that is unchecked. But of course, the checks and balance is definitely diminished and, in fact, absent in many respects.
So it's potentially a very significant area of democratic backsliding.
It is very significant. And of course, in particular, we are seeing that in the Philippines, in the degree of human rights violations, we know the International Criminal Court, but also in the continuing red tagging, so to speak, where any critic or opposition can be branded as a communist and red, and that would expose the person to great peril. You know, that would ensue, violence could ensue from being tagged as a communist.
Ed, the proposition that democracy would serve as an antidote to corruption doesn't appear to have occurred at all in many parts of Asia and Pacific, and Indonesia in particular, being downgraded from mid-performing democracy to a weak one in 2020 due to further declines on the corruption index. How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that corruption is both a defining characteristic and a sort of an Achilles heel of many of the democracies of the region, and I think it's right that Indonesia in many ways provides a sort of illustrative case of some of the problems and some of the ways in which corruption can become entrenched in even quite a democratic system. And so let me mention a couple of factors. One is the relationship between corruption and a patronage-based or a clientelistic electoral system of electoral competition. And that's been one of the real driving forces for the entrenchment of corruption in post-Suharto Indonesia. So, and we see this in many countries in the region, of course, in which politicians win power not so much by contesting over the sort of different political programs, different policy ideas, but rather by competing to provide concrete benefits to constituents, which might come in the form of pork barrel projects for particular villages or urban communities which support them, for targeted support for particular groups, church groups, other religious groups, and so on, which support them, or in many cases, including in Indonesia, individualised vote buying, so envelopes containing cash gifts. And the problem in a country like Indonesia, of course, is that then this incentivises politicians themselves to act corruptly once in office. So Indonesian politicians have this saying that the Indonesian term for it is balik modal, which basically translates as recouping your investment. So you outlay all this money in order to get invested, and including by engaging in often really massive, hundreds of thousands of dollars in scale vote buying efforts. Once you get elected, you rebuild your war chest for the next time by taking kickbacks, engaging in various forms of budgetary corruption and so on. So that's a real problem if there are incentives to engage in corruption right at the sort of the apex of the political system. But the other thing, the other way in which the Indonesian experience illustrates why it's so hard to get rid of corruption in these cases, I think, is that in these cases where corruption becomes entrenched, it becomes a sort of a collective action problem. So you'll often encounter, for example, Indonesian politicians who will say, look, I really don't like what I'm doing here, right? I mean, I can see this isn't good for the system. I'm risking all my family money on buying votes, and I might lose it all and not get elected. But there's no exit plan, there's no exit strategy for them, because they know that if they don't do it, then they definitely won't get elected. And by just the same token, if you're a bureaucrat in a government office that's working under one of these politicians, you might not, in your own moral sense or whatever, you might not want to engage in corruption. But if everyone around you is doing it, it's not simply that if you don't do it, you won't get the additional income. It's that your career will suffer, right? If you're the one who stands out in the office and says, look, I'm not going to take part in this, you can end up being ostracised, being exiled to an office in a remote village, far away from your family and public amenities. So that's the real problem, I think, that we experience in many of these countries, that corruption gets sort of embedded into the very system of democratic competition, and then it becomes this sort of all-encompassing system in which even very well-meaning individuals find it very hard to escape from. So the key is then to try and tip the incentive structures towards, in the case of elections, more programmatic party competition, and to find pathways out of that sort of trap within the bureaucracy as well.
I remember a junior minister when I was working at the China Academy of Governance saying to me that power in China is knowing who to bribe. In other words, it's culturally embedded. So perhaps we're expecting too much, and we should subscribe to Merrily Grindel's notion of good enough governance.
Right. Yeah, maybe, but the problem is with this sort of system, when it's combined with democracy, is it becomes this sort of, self-fulfilling prophecy, or sort of a vicious circle where the voters themselves see their leaders engaging in corruption, and then themselves sort of become rent seekers, right? So that's part of the problem as well. We often look to the public as a sort of circuit breaker, the voting public who discipline corrupt politicians. But if the public themselves sort of have this cynical attitude, loss of trust, don't really have any faith in their politicians, in many cases they'll say things like, well, these people aren't going to help us anyway, so we may as well take what we can at election time. And so that's sort of the problem. So the question, I guess, if we come back to the good enough government sort of proposal, is how to ensure that it stays at good enough and doesn't get worse and worse and worse.
How to break the vicious cycle. Nemat, in the Philippines and in Indonesia, we're witnessing incremental backsliding across the key indices of democratization, where obviously in Afghanistan, before withdrawal, we saw some improvement in relation to media freedoms, gender equality, and certain other areas. But given the return of the Taliban and the ethnic restructuring of central government, should we have any expectation for a democratic future in Afghanistan now?
At the moment, if we think of a best-case scenario for Afghanistan, that option is not available anymore. So what I would think of the least worst-case scenario for Afghanistan, and also the likely scenario that we will be facing, and that's Syriaization of Afghanistan. So the situation continues as it is now. The Islamic State will expand its territorial control. There will be momentum for the resistance forces against the Taliban. And what will be the result? A civil war and worsening of the human conditions. Coming to the what still can be done, the least worst case scenario for Afghanistan, perhaps if there could be still a settlement reached between the Taliban, the de facto, government in Afghanistan, the previous government, some elements, and also political parties and other actors in Afghanistan, to form an inclusive government. But the likelihood is quite low. How the international community can play a role so that we can preserve some of the gains being achieved in the last 2 decades, such as protection of fundamental rights, and access to services. One would be to look at the situation in Afghanistan at the moment, and same could be in other cases. Humanitarian crisis, we are experiencing a deepening humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. The international community can help to prevent it, not by legitimizing the new regime government, but by providing aid directly to people. What that means to bypass the current government, work through humanitarian organizations, NGOs, non-state actors. This is the opposite of my thesis, making the case for the previous regime to work with the government through the state to strengthen the capacity. Now that's not the option. It should be the opposite. And the other one is engaging with alternative sources of authority. What do I mean by that? Different actors who are influential in Afghanistan, local organizations, civil society, Afghans in diaspora, and to do what? To provide support and also to hear their voices, they're repressed. And then coming to another very important area that the international community can leverage, not in the case of Afghanistan, but many other cases that reverse to authoritarianism, is international recognition or legitimation. So no country yet has recognized the Taliban government in Afghanistan. That's an area of leverage that can help to preserve some of the gains in Afghanistan. Though coming to the question of moderation, is there any sign? We don't see any sign of change in the Taliban's policy. Same policies are being enforced as they enforced in the 1990s, restricting access of women from education or to education or work, and also limiting freedom of expression and also media in Afghanistan. So it's quite challenging, but it doesn't mean we lost everything. So what happened in the last 2 decades that the society in Afghanistan has transformed? And that's a source of hope for the future of Afghanistan. And also I would like to bring another issue or highlight it here. That's the history. If we go back and look at the history of Afghanistan, we had 3 republics being collapsed. So this was the 3rd republic in Afghanistan, and 2 eras of democratic politics in Afghanistan. That means always there is a chance of comeback for Afghanistan to raise from the ashes of war as it happened after 2001. The question now is, again, coming to the international community, will they think about some of the lessons learned or not? That's a big question.
So, in a sense, we're talking about reverting back to community-driven development as a potential vehicle for social transformation and working from the bottom up.
That's an important area that can be leveraged to help people. And basically in the 1990s, non-state actors, NGOs, were working through communities with people. And after 2001, we had a pool of Afghan experts who worked with non-governmental organizations and joined the new government to help the country with in its recovery and also reconstruction efforts.
Thank you, Nemat. Now Lena reported that obviously the pandemic has been very challenging for democracy, but there's also been lots of examples of democratic resilience and evidence of how deeply citizens of the world want democracy. So can I ask the panel, how can we build on this resilience and strengthen democracy in advance of the inevitable challenges to come? Shall I ask Ed?
Yeah, for me, and again, I'm speaking primarily as an Indonesia observer here, but one of the things I sort of feel, and this is really a message to the international community as much as anywhere else, is this, is that there's a need to sort of maintain an interest in and support for civil society organizations, the NGO sector and so on, not only in countries which are sort of at the high point of democratic transition, but also those which have made democratic transitions and, but you know, are sort of struggling with building democratic institutions. One of the big lessons, I think, of the Indonesian decline is that when democracy is left purely to sort of the elite actors, when it's left purely to the elected politicians, particularly in a system governed, as I suggested earlier, by patronage politics, you're leaving out a lot of the forces that really drove and secured democratization in the first place. And my feeling is that a lot of international donors, for example, looking at countries like Indonesia, sort of switched too quickly from this sort of civil society support to an institution building phase. And obviously building institutions, government institutions, effective and responsive governmental institutions is critical for democracy, but that role of civil society pressure, watchdog organizations, I think, is really very important. And we're seeing Indonesia is paying a bit of a price, I think, for a decline in civil society activism, which has many different sources. It's largely due to domestic political dynamics, but part of the reason, I think, is the international community sort of took their collective eye off the ball.
So you're seeing this sort of disconnect between the sort of privileged political elite and the sort of exiguously participating electorate.
Yeah, that's right. Because when we assume that public interests and public preferences are expressed purely through the system of democratic representation and accountability, that can completely cut out these additional dynamics, such as clientelism, which in some ways reverse the very, that the system of democratic accountability. You know, if you're buying your votes from voters, I mean, really, they're the ones who are, you know, the politicians then expect to deliver the vote. So you can, in that sort of electoral system, we often lose that pressure for reform, which as democratic theorists we assume is emerging through the system, through the electoral system, right? So you do still need those additional interest groups, pressure groups, civil society organisations and the like.
And that would also be the case in Australia. You know, we leave democratic renewal to politicians at our peril. Imelda, can I talk to you a little bit about the impending elections in the Philippines? Because often, obviously, elections are considered the first and the last bastions of democracy in the sense that they give democracies the ability to self-correct from a dangerous path. So what can we expect from the elections in the Philippines in May 2022?
That's a very hard question. But first, I want to be positive, no? Because the Filipinos has demonstrated time and time again that it can actually overcome all these democratic deficits. But we need to also realize what is the current condition. And I have to mention that we have a deepening sort of polarization. And we confirmed that in our research, even among the youth, there is that widening divide between among the youths in the Philippines, who comprise 52% of the electorate. And that's very concerning, really, because, as I mentioned, the aim of fake news, of disinformation, is precisely to undermine the democratic process and, of course, to subvert the free will of the electorate. So, but I mean, you know, in responding to probably to what Ed said, and I think this is really the reason why international development organizations should more than ever really help civil society organizations, because they are the ones holding the fort. In fact, there are a lot of mobilizations and volunteerism going on at the grassroots, and they need support to ensure that, you know, they can function well. But again, building, you know, institutions is really important, and we can see that, you know, despite the criticisms that the Commission and elections are getting at, in fact, they are also beneficiaries or recipients of fake news. They're really doing their best to ensure that these coming elections would be free and fair. So there is some hope, but at the same time, you know, there is that negativity, because we know that, you know, precisely a lot of, you know, what is happening now is basically to erase, to undermine the gains of the, you know, of democracy that we have gained in the past decades. And this is, you know, the force now, that strong force that is being presented to us, and that, you know, holds some attraction to certain sectors of the population.
Thank you. Look, we're running out of time for our discussion. So I just want to end by asking you all one question with a very quick response. And that's the big elephant in the room. Does the Chinese model provide a compelling alternative in the three countries that you're studying? Ed.
It's not a what's the word? It's not a role model or a pathway, but it's a compelling example for many Indonesian elites who don't want to replicate the Chinese model, but they'll say, look, there's a country that's authoritarian yet is successful. So I think it is an important counterbalance, or the rise of China has proven to be a really significant game changer for the tide of democratization in the region. Yep.
Nemad.
In Afghanistan, once we experienced a managed planned economy and also a communist regime, which didn't work, and that led to more conflict, didn't help the country to resolve its problems. And the history shows in Afghanistan that there's no substitute to a just and inclusive order in Afghanistan. I don't think so it will be an option, but perhaps Afghanistan would look at China, how it could benefit from, when it comes to the economy and access to its markets. But when it comes to the regime, I think there will be issues also soon.
So the historic memory of the Soviet model is a deterrence. Imelda?
I think, despite a lot of efforts to hard sell the Chinese model to the Philippines, we know that at the grassroots, at the people, I think are resisting. I can't say for some sector of the elites who are definitely probably, are very much, into some of them into that model. But I'm pretty, with the public opinion, I guess, and what, of course, China has demonstrated on the Philippines in terms of its aggression on the West Philippine Sea, we can see that definitely the people most of the people are resisting that model.
Well, it just remains for me to say many thanks to our panelists for an insightful and, I think, passionate discussion on the future of democracy. So thank you.
And many thanks to Professor Evans for so effectively leading the discussion. Professor Evans and panelists, please go back to your seats. Thank you. And many thanks to Professor Evans for so effectively leading the discussion. Professor Evans and panelists, please go back. We have now come very close to the end of our event. To formally close the event, I would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Bernard Philip, Ambassador of Australia to Sweden, Finland, and Latvia. Ambassador Philip, residing in Stockholm, represents Australia as Chair of International Ideas Council of Member States in 2021. Is the Ambassador online? Yes. Without further ado, the screen is yours, Ambassador.
Audrey, and greetings again from Stockholm. Australia was a founding member of International IDEA in 1995, and we've had the honour of chairing the Council of Member States for 2021. We value the work IDEA undertakes to strengthen democratic institutions worldwide, and particularly in our region. We're very pleased that the State of Democracy in Asia and the Pacific 2021 report could be launched at the Museum of Australian Democracy in Canberra during our time as Chair of International IDEA. And I would like to join others in recognising the efforts of all those involved in producing the report and the larger Global State of Democracy report, and congratulate the Secretary-General of International IDEA and all of the Secretariat on its release. As has been demonstrated today, the Global State of Democracy report plays a crucial role in upholding democratic principles. Shining a light on the performance of governments encourages accountability and provides transparency, key pillars of democracy and fundamental to ensuring populations maintain confidence in government. Unfortunately, as the report acknowledges, our region and the world overall has seen an erosion of democratic rights and freedoms since the beginning of the pandemic. We are also seeing new threats to democracy emerging, including disinformation and misinformation, which challenge even the most resilient and long-standing democracies such as Australia. So we must continue to be vocal advocates for democratic values domestically and globally, including in the United Nations, and help build the capability and resilience of countries in our region against authoritarianism and disinformation. Australia values our membership of International IDEA, and we welcome its influential role in the global democracy agenda. Australia will always be a defender of democratic values, and with the support of organisations such as IDEA, we can ensure future generations around the world will get to enjoy all the benefits that democratic systems afford their nations and peoples. So finally, thank you to all the participants in this event, A special thanks to the panelists and to Lena and the International IDEA team in Asia and the Pacific for organising this important event. For those in Canberra, I hope you enjoy the opportunity to continue the discussion in the wonderful surrounds of Old Parliament House, and we look forward to the Global State of Democracy report launch in Stockholm tomorrow. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those closing remarks. That marks the end of our event. Many thanks once again to those who have spoken today. Dr. Daryl Karp, His Excellency Dr. Casas-Zamora, Honorable Audrey Tang, Ms. Lena Rikla-Tamang, Professor Mark Evans, Professor Edward Aspinall, Dr. Imelda Dainla, Dr. Nematullah Bizan, and His Excellency the Ambassador Bernard Philip. Our gratitude also goes to the distinguished participants here at the Old Parliament House and online. We are so happy to have you with us. The GSOD Asia and the Pacific report is available to download from IDEA's website. The GSOD Indices and Global Monitor on COVID-19 can be accessed there too. Launch events from across IDEA offices will take place in the coming days, as the Ambassador mentioned, in Stockholm tomorrow. The Melanesia launch, co-hosted by The Voice Inc. in Papua New Guinea, will be on 7 December. For those present at the Old Parliament House, you're invited to the reception after this. I apologize that we didn't have time for question and answers, but at the reception, of course, you are free to ask questions to the panelists and also to Lena. Thank you and farewell. Good evening.